G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can use a tennis ball, or in this case a lacrosse ball, to instantly improve your hip mobility. And we're going to do so by focusing on a few key areas that tend to get tight in a lot of people who are suffering from a lot of hip pain, groin pain, but also low back pain as well. And mobilizing these muscles through the front of the hip, the side of the hip, and the back of the hip can be a really advantageous way to feed some slack to all the areas that rely on those areas and hopefully get your symptoms to settle very quickly. Now, the first thing we want to talk about before we get to these exercises is that we need to consider what ball you're going to use and what surface you're going to do this on. Now, obviously, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use a lacrosse ball, and I really enjoy these the most because they are a little bit grippy. They're also not super rock hard, and they're not super soft. So I do find it's a very respectful tool to use when trying to mobilize tissue that's potentially going to be a little bit tender, as well as tight and restricted. Now, as you're doing these exercises, if you do find that it is a little bit too tender for you, then please choose something like a tennis ball. It's going to make this experience a lot more beneficial for you. If we go in and challenge this tissue and really dig in super deep and really work into something that's already feeling threatened and sore, then it's unlikely that that tissue is going to feel safe enough to give and respectfully release as quickly as we want it to. And there's also a risk that if you're jamming a ball into an area that's already tender and sore and threatened, then there's every chance you might actually feel a little bit more tender the next day, or even flare up some of your symptoms if you're in genuine pain at the time of doing this exercise. Then it's unlikely you're going to get the most out of these exercises. So in this instance, harder doesn't necessarily mean better, but respecting how you feel generally means that things will progress a lot faster based on what you're trying to do. So the first thing we want to do with this is we're actually going to go through some of the tissue at the front of your hip. And we're going to do this with an eye to potentially looking for that sort of hip flexor, that iliopsoas, and obviously any TFL that might be caught in amongst that as well. So what we're going to get you to do is, if you find the hip bone at the front of your hip, we're going to place the ball on that and then literally roll it straight into the middle. And this is more likely going to be where some of those tight hip flexors reside. Please, please, please respect how you feel and do this exercise as hard or as soft as you need to do based on that. Now, there's three things that we're going to cover for each area. The first one is an exercise or a version of this exercise that I'm sure everyone's done before. And because we're using a ball, the tendency for everyone when doing this exercise is to automatically roll up and down on the area, or to roll side to side depending on where it is. But there's almost like a bony channel here. If you're inside that hip bone, you'll be able to move up and down from that. I don't find that this is the best way to make change with tissue, particularly if that tissue is already tender and sensitized. It feels more of a superficial gliding over those tissues. You can dig it in a little bit and do the same thing, but I don't find that this will give you the best results out of the three that we're going to do. Do the one that you feel gives you the best access to your tightness and potential tenderness, and the one that you feel gives you the most bang for your buck, that gives you the best results, the most mobility immediately after doing this exercise. So for me, I'm not a big fan of trying to roll up and down along this hip flexor or any other muscles in the hips. What I do like to do here is sometimes it's nice to sort of almost straighten your knee and lift your knee up off the ground a little bit, just to put your hip into some relative extension. And that might help you sort of find and expose some of this hip flexor tightness that you may not get if your knee's down on the ground. Similarly, if you're lying down flat and having a hunt around, you may not necessarily be able to get into this hip flexor tightness as well as you could, as if you are maybe more extended. Again, this is going to expose some of that hidden tightness that being flat doesn't, because again, you're going to get some more relative hip extension, but that hip flexor or the muscles at the front of the hip, some of them attach to the front of your spine. So by extending that spine, you're essentially lengthening that tissue, making it more obvious to find any of those restrictions that you might have. The second thing that we're going to do here is we're actually going to do some tensing, relaxing to get your brain and nervous system involved, to try and allow some of that tissue to give a little bit faster than just rolling up and down on the ball. When you find that spot that feels the most tight or the most restricted, try and tense everything up. So squeeze your abs, squeeze your butt cheek, tense your quads, push your knee down into the ground, tense all the muscles in the area, get your brain and nervous system involved. And what happens when you have a maximal activation and a maximal tensing, you get a maximal relaxation as well. What you might find is when you release that tension, you might find that the ball actually sinks deeper into that tissue than it did beforehand. it may feel less tight, less tender than it did immediately before. The third version of this exercise that I find works really well is kind of like a flossing type exercise. We're going to incorporate movement into this because obviously your body is wired for movement, but we're going to keep the ball jammed into here and essentially shear this tissue past the ball. So we're going to hopefully allow some of that soft tissue to give and that connective tissue to sort of give and sort of mobilize a little bit better. So again, there's a couple of different ways we can do this. If you've got the ball in a good spot, you can bend that knee up a little bit and then brace yourself. So what we're going to get you to do is just very, very gently, we can get you to lift your knee off the ground. So make sure that you try and sort of tense your glutes and lift your knee up from your hip. If you do it from your hamstring, some people can find that this can cause a little bit of a cramp. But again, that probably says more about the state of your back, the state of your glutes, than it does the state of your hamstring. Again, we're trying to lengthen that sort of hip flexor or the tissue at the front of the hip. We're really trying to shear that tissue free. You can obviously do this with your legs straight if you feel like your hamstring's a bit of a problem. The other thing that we can do here is we can do the same thing by extending through your low back. We can keep the pressure on the ball. We can try and lengthen that tissue in a way that keeps the ball there, but respectfully shears that tissue free. Another way that we can do this is we can also rotate through the hip. So obviously a lot of the tissue at the front of the hip doesn't necessarily rotate the hip, but rotation of that hip when the ball's jammed in there can be a really great stimulus to try and free up some of that tissue. You get a little bit of a different pull. Again, choose the position you feel most comfortable with. You can bring your leg out to the side a little bit more. You can keep it in line. In line's probably going to make you feel a little bit better and give you the best results. Now, the second part of this is we're going to locate some of the tight tissue at the side of the hip. Now, again, it doesn't matter what it is. This can be more of your TFL at the side. It can be some portion of those glutes, like your glute med, and obviously your glute max over the top. Doesn't really matter because we're going to go hunting regardless. So, same rules apply. If you find that hip bone at the side, if we come up from that, what you'll find there's a little bit of a gap there between the greater trochanter, that hip bone at the side, and the tip of your pelvis, the tip of that hip at the top. So what we want to get you to do, again, the first of those three is if you roll that ball around and up and down, you might find that there are some tightnesses in that area, and you can roll forward a little bit just to make sure you're not missing that connection between the front of your hip and the side of the hip. Make sure you're not missing anything here. You can do this with your legs straight. It's obviously going to help expose some of the tissue that's more at the front side of that side of the hip. But then if you want to get a little bit more towards the back without going towards the back, you might find that by bending your hip and knee up into more flexion, you're really going to expose some of the tightness in the tissues that lengthen in this position. So same thing again, you can roll around on that if you feel like it helps more than anything else, it's completely fine. But taking cues from the previous example, ideally we want to find a spot that feels a little bit tight here. We want to tense that tissue up so you can push your foot down into the ground, squeeze your glutes at the side, tense up the tissue underneath that ball, hold that for 5 to 10 seconds, and then when you relax, you should feel like it sinks in a little bit deeper. You can time this with your breathing where you take a deep breath in, squeeze everything under the ball, hold that for a few seconds, and then relax to, again, hopefully help cue that tissue into releasing a little bit faster. And then again, as we did in the previous example, what we can find here is if we can find a spot that feels a little bit tight, we can then incorporate movement into the mix. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to rotate my foot upwards with my knee straight. This is a really good way to really help lengthen some of the tissue at the side of the hip. Again, that sort of constant motion allows us to shear that free. We can do obviously more hip flexion and hip extension, bigger movements to really get that tissue to free up throughout the course of the range. And then also what we can get you to do is if you bend your knee up to about, your hip and knee up to about 90 degrees, by then lifting your knee up off the ground while keeping your foot on the ground, we should be able to then increase the amount of rotation that goes through that hip while keeping the same constant amount of gentle and respectful pressure through the ball to really try and shear that free. And then again, what you'll hopefully find here is you should hopefully find that automatically it does feel a lot looser than it did before. This time we want to place the ball basically where your back pocket would be. So if you find that hip bone at the side of the hip again, and go back in towards the back of that hip where that piriformis might be. If we go up and down from this point, we're also going to hit a lot of the hip external rotators, the deeper ones. Again, the names don't matter. All that matters is how you feel. Now, if you have your leg out straight, you might find that you can still hit some of the rotators in that deep hip at the back, but it's not until you really bend that hip up a little bit that you'll find that you can really expose some of that hidden restriction. So you might need to make sure that you're really exploring all the way up to the top of the bony ridge of your pelvis, and then all the way down basically to the base of your gluteal fold, or where the sit bone is, or the base of your butt cheek might be, all the way into basically your SIJ, or where your butt crack tends to be. That sort of square of tissue can get very tight. If you have low back pain, if your hips are stiff from sitting all the time, it can contribute to low back pain. It can also be one of the reasons why your groins are hurting if your hips stiff and you're having some back issues as well. So again, roll around on that if you feel comfortable. The other thing that we can get you to do again, of course, is if you find a spot that feels pretty juicy, and again, that piriformis muscle is sort of going to be in the middle of all of this. Find a spot that feels a little bit tight and tender, squeeze that tightness, push your foot back into the ground, get your glutes to tense up, hold this for a couple of seconds, relax, get that tissue to give and free up as quickly as possible. And again, once you've found a spot that you want to maybe mobilize a little bit better, then again, you can bend and flex your hip as far as you feel comfortable. You might find at the top part of this hip flexion movement is going to give you more bias towards that sort of back of the hip. But then also with your knee bent, we can still do some of the rotational movements as well to really block that tightness, shear that tightness free as best as you feel comfortable. And with these exercises, I think you'll find that automatically those hips will instantly feel a lot looser than what they did previously. Now, the other important thing to do, just to finish off this video, it's important to plant the seed to say that if you're working hard on this and you're freeing things up, make sure that you're also looking at your low back function, your deeper hip joint function, and your strength and general flexibility to make sure that if this does free up, it stays loose and you're not having to consistently battle against this. So once again, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Let me know down in the comments below which particular gluteal muscle or hip muscle you found was the most tender. I'd be amazed if it wasn't the piriformis, but it might be another one. Let me know. And then catch up with me in the next video and we'll take it from there.